All right, so we'll end off the semester with the rise of especially anti-American terrorism. And in order to understand, especially leading up to the September 11th attacks, the sources and the causes and the rationale for those kinds of things, we have to go back into the Cold War and understand U.S. foreign policy relations, especially with the Middle East. And it's not a pretty history. So this is a general kind of map that I looked at, mostly in order to give you a feeling for where the Middle East is. And it's not just those few countries, it spans a little bit more. But that region in compared to other places we've talked a lot about, especially Europe. So it's not far away. Another kind of regional map of the area. So southeastern Europe going into southwestern Asia is generally called the Middle East. It's like the intersection of Eastern Europe into Northern Africa and southwestern Asia. So those are the countries that tend to dominate. We'll talk a lot about, especially Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran going forward. The United States had intervened in these places, much as Europeans had for at least into the 1800s. The United States starts its interventions mostly in the wake of World War II because the British and the French really ruled much of the Middle East after World War I. So when the British and French empires go into collapse after World War II, basically because the Europeans can't afford them anymore, they have to rebuild their own countries. They can't afford to hold their large empires, their global empires anymore. In many instances, the United States takes up the role of dominance in several of those empires. Southeast Asia, places in Latin America, but also in relationship to Iran in particular. And we've already talked about in Iran in light of the idea of post-colonial nationalist movements and the fear of communism in the United States and the fear of the spread of communism across the world, especially by the American leadership. So the American leadership and the American population comes to believe that communism is like this one idea, and wherever communists rise up, they want to sign alliances with the Soviet Union. It's not exactly true, but a lot of indigenous leaders that rise up in different parts of the world are assumed, if they have like socialist programs that they advocate, it is assumed that they are communist and want to form alliances with the Soviets. One of these areas was in 1954 in Iran. Iran underwent a democratic election and elected government leaders through democracy, through voting of the Iranian people. And that government started doing things that and particularly the American government did not like. The biggest thing that the Iranian government did was to nationalize oil fields and to take a lot of foreign companies' property in Iran and basically declare it to be government property. That's what nationalization means. So it's a government takeover of privately owned businesses, and usually American and British oil companies. The Americans didn't like that very much, and so the idea of promoting some kind of coup against the Iranian government spreads in the high levels of the U.S. administration, all the way up to President Eisenhower, who approves a CIA intervention in Iran that basically starts riots and starts an uprising that topples the Iranian government and puts a kind of former member of a royal family known as the Shah into power. So the Shah will run Iran for the next couple decades through pretty brutal means of repression. So we've talked about all this at length, right? Repeatedly. So that's one instance of the U.S. intervening undemocratically and, in fact, in this instance, anti-democratically to repress the Iranian people's voice and their vote. That led to a revolution in Iran that was largely an anti-Western and anti-American revolution because the Iranian people understood that they were basically occupied by a foreign force and ruled by a Shah who was basically an American puppet, who was supported by the American government. And when that support was finally withdrawn, he fell very quickly. So there are anti-American leaders in control of Iran, and largely right down to this day. So U.S. foreign policy turned in the 1980s especially to be, especially in the Middle East, anti-Iran. U.S. foreign policy was to hurt Iran by any means necessary. And the way they found to do this was to build alliances with powerful countries on Iran's borders in order to at least stop Iran's growth or to try to stop its ability to project power in the region. So the United States largely signs up Saudi Arabia and Iraq as American allies to do battle against Iran. And that is very obvious and not very controversial at all. The Reagan administration signed up a lot of anti-Iranian groups throughout the Middle East because Iran in the 1980s was basically one of the big boogeymen for the American people because of the revolution, the hostage crisis, and on and on and on. So in that way, the U.S. leadership made deals, especially with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Gave him weapons, gave him money, especially when Hussein launched a war against Iran. With full knowledge of what he was doing with those weapons, even against his own people. So it's really nothing new for American foreign policy to do those kinds of things, but it's something that a lot of Americans don't like to remember. And it's very easy to prove when you see Pentagon officials, U.S. Department of Defense leaders going to Iraq. And in this photograph, this video, very clearly shaking hands with Hussein and making military deals with him. The Iran versus Iraq war was one of the bloodiest in the 1980s throughout the whole world. It was savage use of chemical and biological weapons across it, and millions of people being killed. It's really horrendous stuff. Another thing that's going on in the 1980s is the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in order to get a Soviet influence into the Middle East. So the United States, again, starts signing up anyone in the Middle East that's willing to go fight against the Soviet army in Afghanistan, including several Saudi people from Saudi Arabia, who go to Afghanistan and basically agree to be guerrilla fighters. They'll hide out in the hills and the mountains and whatnot and launch hit-and-run tactic types attacks against the Soviet army in order to break as much of the Soviet army as they possibly could and stop its influence from going into the Middle East. The groups that are funded and given weapons by the U.S. government, in particular in Afghanistan, are called the Mujahideen. And one of their more famous kind of small-scale leaders is a guy named Bin Laden, who took training from the CIA and took American weapons funneled through Israel and Pakistan. And again, none of this is controversial. It's pretty well proven. And Bin Laden becomes a hero throughout the Middle East, because Bin Laden says that he and his fighters are willing to fight against any Western incursion into Muslim-dominated countries. Bin Laden and many others take the view that the Middle Eastern countries should be allowed to govern themselves without influence or pressure from outside, and especially from Europe, because that's where the pressure had historically been. And by the 1980s, that pressure had been on since 1919, 1920. So it's been going on for decades, and Bin Laden's aware of it, and a lot of people living in the Middle East are very aware of it. So even while the Iraq-Iran war is going on, this is happening in Afghanistan. Eventually those fighters are successful in forcing the Red Army to leave, to withdraw, to leave Afghanistan and go back north. So questions about any of this so far? But again, this is the United States deciding what enemies they have in a certain region and then signing up anyone in that area to fight against what the Americans perceive to be an enemy of the United States. So that's going on until the late 80s, when the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union and its control in Eastern Europe collapses. And this is where a lot of American policymakers, very much distracted by what to do about Eastern Europe and the end of the Cold War, Hussein at this point very much stops taking orders from the United States and starts making his own decisions, which a lot of American leaders don't like. Hussein built up his basically American-funded and American-built army in Iraq and invades a southern neighbor, a small country to the south of Iraq called Kuwait. Invades Kuwait, conquers it, and announces that he is annexing Kuwait, which means Kuwait will become a part of Iraq.
What was the reason for the invasion? Was it for oil, or what was it?
Yeah, Kuwait has huge oil wealth, and it appears that Saddam Hussein is one of these people who dreams about unifying the whole Middle East under one dominant political leadership, and he wants to be that leader. And he was very vocal about that. It's pretty well known. So it appears that he thought that Kuwait would be the first in his large movement to do this. And that with the United States being distracted in Europe, that he would get away with it. He didn't largely because Kuwait is a big oil-producing nation, therefore has economic and political ties to the United States. So immediately, countries like Britain, the United States, and France immediately demand that Hussein withdraw his army from Kuwait and allow Kuwait to be its own country again. And they threaten to invade Kuwait if he doesn't do so. So there's a standoff going into late 1990. The Americans will start building military bases in the area to launch an invasion of Kuwait. And some interesting things happen. The war in Afghanistan against the Soviets is over. Bin Laden has gone back home to Saudi Arabia. So Bin Laden is in his home country with a lot of his group. And Bin Laden is watching this happen in Kuwait. And Bin Laden goes to the Saudi king. The Saudi king very much hated Hussein. And Bin Laden makes an offer to the Saudi king, or through his intermediaries, his kind of contacts. Makes an offer. Bin Laden says, "Give me weapons and money, and I'll take my people into Iraq and do the same thing to Hussein that we did to the Soviets in Afghanistan. Launch a guerrilla tactic type war, an insurgency basically, and drag them down from within. Therefore, Saudi Arabia will be made safe from attack by Hussein because Bin Laden saying we're going to go knock out his government." That's the deal that he offers the Saudi king. And the Saudi king is very much worried that Iraq is going to invade them too, Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, the king of Saudi Arabia is getting another offer, this time from the United States. And the American leadership under the first President Bush says, our offer is, if you allow us to build air bases and military structures in Saudi Arabia, we will do that, and we will launch the invasion of Kuwait and destroy Hussein's army, therefore eliminating the threat against Saudi Arabia. And the deal that the United States promises is the Saudi king gets to order them out, the American troops out of Saudi Arabia whenever the king decides. And the king weighs these two options and decides to go with the American deal. Believing that the United States military is much more reliable, bigger, stronger, more technologically advanced, hits harder. Much more reliable force to destroy Hussein's power than this kind of ragtag group of guerrilla fighters that Bin Laden offers to lead. So the king goes with the American offer, and Bin Laden is angered to no end. Bin Laden starts giving speeches and starts issuing, kind of policy statements and whatnot, saying that the king of Saudi Arabia is a fool. The king is possibly corrupt or inept. The king doesn't seem to understand that when the United States gets its military into Saudi Arabia, they will never leave. They will find one excuse after another, year after year, to keep their military in Saudi Arabia. Because they're not just in it to knock out Hussein. The U.S. is in it to control the Middle East. That's Bin Laden's statement. And it's generally not a very wise thing to, if you're living in a country that's ruled by a king, to call that king an idiot or a sellout. And that's exactly what Bin Laden is saying publicly at the end of 90, going into 91. Therefore, he becomes an outlaw in Saudi Arabia. He has to leave Saudi Arabia because if he's caught, he'll probably be executed. So he and his group leave Saudi Arabia and go to a place that is still not known. We don't know exactly where they went for the next few years. But he does get out of Saudi Arabia and survives. So Bin Laden is a background to this whole thing. He's still milling around and completely angry that the United States has taken this opportunity to, in Bin Laden's view, gain a foothold in the Middle East for long-term control. Well, of course, that's not what the Americans say. So, questions about Bin Laden at all?
Was Bin Laden born in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah,
or?
he was born in Saudi Arabia. His family's in Saudi Arabia still. They're one of the richer families in the Middle East. The Bin Ladens are a very wealthy family. It was estimated that his monthly allowance is like $20 million. And he's one of the kind of lesser known sons of the kind of Bin Laden. I think it's a financial and construction kind of empire company. It's very, very wealthy. And of course, we know what he did with that money. Okay, so the U.S. builds a worldwide coalition that they call the Coalition. And they launch the attack against Kuwait to knock Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. They include as many Middle Eastern and Arab states as they possibly can because they don't want this to be seen as a Western war against a Middle Eastern country. And they very notably make sure that Israel is not included in this coalition. So the so-called Operation Desert Storm is an undeniable, ridiculous victory for the West. The coalition is completely dominated by U.S. forces. So the British sent a small army, the French sent a few, and Japan sent a few, but that's it. It's mostly American, overwhelmingly American force. And it is almost completely an Air Force victory. The United States uses its technological superiority, basically laser-guided bombs, to destroy Hussein's army in Kuwait and bomb strategic places in Baghdad and whatnot. This is all the kind of stuff that I imagine if you go on YouTube now, you can see the night scope vision kind of stuff with the bombing going on, where all the buildings are in green and whatnot. Have you seen this stuff? No, apparently not. But this was shocking stuff to the world because they're basically watching a war live on CNN. And this is where CNN comes to prominence. Prominence is their big story. They cover this 24/7. So they eventually kill somewhere around 25,000 Iraqi soldiers. Take somewhere around 200,000 Iraqi soldiers prisoner, so a gigantic victory, while losing only a few thousand coalition troops, and again, mostly U.S. soldiers, or a few hundred. It's not even a few thousand. And they, in Baghdad itself, kill a few thousand Iraqi civilians by bombing government buildings and whatnot. So Saddam Hussein's army is knocked out of Kuwait completely, and the next big question is, does the United States invade Iraq itself and completely remove Saddam Hussein from power entirely? Leaders in Washington, D.C. decide no, that is too risky for several reasons. Number one, the Republican administration in the White House decides that invading Iraq and trying to occupy and rebuild its government would be a disaster. The Iraqi people would not accept it. They might be able to knock out Saddam Hussein's government, but that would lead to some kind of probably civil conflict, and who knows what the outcome of that would be. They also understood that would be a region-wide reluctance to see the United States completely topple another Middle Eastern government and try to decide who the future leadership is going to be. That didn't seem to have a lot of long-term success, going all the way back to even the 1950s. And people of that region are very aware of that history. And there is also a belief that by destroying large chunks of Hussein's army, that the Iraqi people would rise up against him themselves and therefore topple him with minimal U.S. help. So all these things seem to be inspiring or motivating the U.S. leadership to not launch the giant invasion of Iraq and go all the way to Baghdad and knock Hussein out. And there is a revolutionary movement against Hussein at this point, and he crushes it brutally and wipes out entire villages when they declare their independence from his government, try to rise up. At first he started doing this by taking what few helicopters he had left and launching them against to attack his own population, especially in the Kurdish area in the north and the Shia-dominated area in the south. Hussein and his party, the Ba'ath Party, were Sunni-dominated. You tend to know the differences. If not, that's fine for this class. Okay. So the U.S. Air Force, or the U.S. government, is watching Hussein pretty much destroy his own population so that he can stay in control of the Iraqi government. And in the treaty that ended the Persian Gulf War, the U.S. forced Hussein to accept so-called no-fly zones in the north and in the south, just south of Baghdad. So Hussein was not allowed for many years to fly helicopters or military planes through those two large no-fly zones because he had massacred his own people, and the U.S. wants to stop him from doing that. The problem for this is that the U.S. Air Force largely will patrol those two no-fly zones on a constant basis, year after year after year. So obviously they're not going to be taking off from San Diego or something and flying all the way over there and flying all the way back. They need more local bases. Therefore, the United States goes to the Saudi king and says, remember all those air bases we built along your border? We would like to keep those in existence and use those far into the future to enforce the no-fly zones. And this seemed to be direct evidence to people like Bin Laden that this was a U.S. plan from the beginning, to get a foothold in the Middle East and to establish a base where they can launch dominant attacks throughout the whole region in order to basically take over the whole region. And Bin Laden advertises his complaint about this, and a lot of people throughout the region agree. They don't like that the U.S. is doing this. And the Saudi government starts to be viewed more as an American puppet than anything else. And many people in that region still view the Saudi government as little more than just an American placeholder, someone who follows orders from the United States. So this no-fly zone is ongoing through the rest of the 90s, for the next 10 years. And it's expensive, but it is enforced. And every once in a while, Hussein launches a helicopter or something and gets shot down. Or he tries to do something internally, and the U.S. bombs a factory or something in Iraq to prevent him from developing some kind of weapons. This is an ongoing thing through the 90s. So Hussein is still in power in Baghdad. His capability is very much annihilated. So he tries to rebuild his army, but he can't really do much with it. And Hussein is basically, now that the Cold War has ended, the big boogeyman for the United States in the 90s. He's the one that the Americans fear and define him as the source of evil in the world. And he was a pretty evil guy. Killed huge amounts of people to stay in power. It's not uncommon in the world. In fact, the Saudis have done the same thing. So questions about any of this? Okay, so Bin Laden goes off, and we don't know exactly again where he went. We now know, obviously, that he took up residence and established training camps in Afghanistan. After the Soviets were pushed out of Afghanistan, the United States did not determine the next Afghan government, so a new Afghan Civil War emerged. And basically a religious fundamentalist group took control of Afghanistan that Bin Laden and his followers tend to have a lot of theological agreements with. So they went to Afghanistan, and the Afghan government protected him and gave him a kind of shelter and gave him the opportunity to build up what we now know as small-scale terrorist training grounds. So Bin Laden, going into the mid-90s, creates what we now tend to know as Al-Qaeda, which is translates directly to the base, which means the first step in what he views as a larger movement, larger than himself, and advertised this idea in several public statements in the mid-90s, which are on the the library website for you can go in and read. So when you read these things, several things become very, very clear. What his long-term project is, what he hopes to accomplish. And he outright says it may not be accomplished in his lifetime. It may take decades and decades and decades. But he has 4 things he really thinks that he has to do. And his large goal, number 1, is to force the removal of all Western military and economic structures, so Western power, from Arab lands, which are usually dominated by Muslims. So he basically says we want these countries to govern themselves without intrusion, particularly from the United States. So he defines the United States as the great evil in the world. Bin Laden is smart enough to understand that you're not going to attack the U.S. Army head-on and survive. The U.S. Army, the U.S. military, is too technologically advanced, has too many soldiers, has too many bombs, on and on and on. His small-scale group is not going to start a kind of World War III against the U.S. Army and survive. So instead, he decides and publicly says that his group will launch terrorist attacks against Western populations. What the Americans will come to call soft targets, not military targets usually. Why does he say that, especially the American population, is a justifiable target? Why go kill the average kind of American out there? Because they vote for Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly. And if you look at the last election from a month ago, Republicans and Democrats, at least the presidential candidates, got 98% of the vote. What is the difference in their foreign policy? Bin Laden and others say virtually nothing. So if you vote for Republicans or Democrats, Bin Laden says you are guilty of supporting the dominance of other countries because you're voting for that foreign policy. Therefore, if you vote for it, you're willingly participating in it, and therefore, you are a target. So he's using your theory of democracy against you. So he says we're going to attack population centers, valuable places in the United States, economic places of economic kind of strategic importance and kind of symbolic importance. These are going to be largely suicide missions because it's very difficult to attack those kinds of structures and actually get away with it. So a lot of his fighters become dedicated religiously because largely that's the only reason to motivate someone to go off and kill themselves, right? You can't pay someone enough to go off and set off a bomb that they're going to die in, right? So the only way to really motivate someone to do this is to promise them what? If you do this, you're getting rid of evil in the world. God is going to like you. God will let you into heaven and give you all kinds of benefits. That is one of the only ways. You can't pay people to do it. There's almost no other worldly thing you can give people to motivate them to willingly do this kind of stuff. So a lot of this group are religious fundamentalists who absolutely believe in this kind of message, and they start preparing and training to do it. In the long term, though, and he talked about this a little bit, it's fairly vague. He not only wants to remove American, especially, but Western military and economic powers in general from Arab places, but he also wanted to topple a lot of those governments that had been willingly making deals with the United States, like the Saudi government. He wants to topple them and create new governments, and from his speeches you can tell that his proposals are largely theocratic, which means he wants these new governments to be ruled by religious ideas and not what we call secular political ideas. So his theology is very conservative. It's violent. It is declaring anyone who doesn't join you as an infidel, and bad things can happen to them justifiably in his mind. So what kind of governments they would want to create in the long term would probably be some kind of religious dictatorship, which could turn very ugly, and that's one of the terms that's thrown around as a caliphate. So it'd be like people in the United States arguing that the United States government should be run by biblical law. which I think very few people in the United States actually want, because it would destroy women's rights. All kinds of things would become very ugly. People would be stoned to death for adultery. So fairly unpopular, I would think. But this is the view that a lot of Muslims even have of Bin Laden. He's an extremist. He's a radical. His view of Islam is very violent, very repressive of anyone who would disagree. So he's, to most Muslims, this guy's way out on the fringes. And he is decried, and kind of a lot of Muslims view him as an insult to Islam, basically. So questions about his long-term ideas at all? Nope. Okay. And he immediately starts putting this kind of plan into effect and starts looking for targets in the United States. The United States at this point is not aware that Al-Qaeda even exists, and will not be aware of that for another few years. And it appears that Al-Qaeda immediately targeted the World Trade Center in New York City as a place to destroy, because of its economic significance, and it's also symbolic significance. This is a thing that the U.S. built in the early 70s that displayed U.S. economic and industrial power to the world. And it's some of the tallest buildings in the world, and housed a lot of the major U.S. corporations. So Bin Laden and his group very quickly target the Trade Center. The Trade Center is bombed. They took basically a few vans full of explosives and parked them in the parking structure underneath, so kind of in the basement of the Trade Center, and tried to blow them up to destroy the pillars and then therefore knock the buildings down. Did not work, because the pillars holding up those buildings are extraordinarily strong. And they were built with the plan in mind of being bombed or having a plane hit them, which is an interesting thing. So the bombing destroyed much of the stuff in the parking structure itself, but did not knock the buildings down. The people who did the bombing, this was not a suicide mission. They basically planted the bomb and then drove off as fast as they could. They were caught by the FBI in a matter of days, which gave a kind of false sense of security to the American population. The Clinton administration, in charge at this point, basically announces that these guys were just some kind of rogue individual wackos who just wanted to blow some stuff up. So the U.S. government isn't even aware of Al-Qaeda, does not talk about this kind of stuff with the American population. So Clinton's in charge at this point, and the American government is very much in the dark about Bin Laden and his group and what they plan to do. And that is proven by statements from leaders of the Clinton administration, even going into the mid-90s. And it does not appear that the Clinton administration became aware of Al-Qaeda until about 1995 or 96. So in his re-election in 96, Clinton starts openly talking about the U.S. is so militarily dominant in the world that no country dares face the United States in a war. So Clinton's statement is that the wars of the 21st century will not be against rival governments for world power, but will be against small-scale terrorist groups, what he calls international terrorism. And when he wins re-election, goes into his second term in 97, starts moving to establish some kind of central brain trust of counterterrorism within the Pentagon, and having contacts with the CIA and whatnot to keep tabs on, by what they already, by this point, by 98, understand Al-Qaeda exists. They start keeping track of Bin Laden. They know where he is. They start launching assassination attempts against him, which either are aborted, which means they don't completely go through, or the few attempts that do go through actually are mistakes, and they bomb places that Bin Laden wasn't at. And in August, late summer of 98, Bin Laden's group bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania. And Clinton's response within hours, and later becomes official government policy, is to declare that counterterrorism is equal to any U.S. foreign policy or military strategy. So basically, Clinton is defining Bin Laden's group and terrorism in general as just as important as, say, the threat from Russia or the threat from Germany, or the threat from China. So he elevates these small terrorist groups to be hugely important to U.S. national security. And starts giving directives, and even sometimes saying publicly that the number one goal, foreign policy goal for the United States, is to kill Bin Laden, and number two is to destroy Al-Qaeda. But they aren't willing to invade other countries to do it. They want to get agreements with other countries first. And that's problematic. So questions about this? I mean, it's very important to elevate a terrorist group as being just as important as the threat from the Chinese military. That's a big statement. Yeah?
Were there a lot of people killed in the first bombing?
Depends on what you think of as a lot. I mean, do you think more than 6 is a lot? I mean, there are several people killed and wounded. But nothing like September 11th. Nowhere close to that.
Why did they choose the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania?
Oh, because they're easier to hit. And when you do them both on the same day, or within a couple days, it's an international statement. So, and they'll launch other attacks. They attack a U.S. ship. I can't remember which waters it was in, but they bomb the USS Cole and try to sink it. It doesn't eventually work, but they kill some U.S. sailors on it. So. Those are the charges that will eventually be filed against Bin Laden for leading these attacks. Okay, so Clinton has served up until his second term. George W. Bush, goes into the White House in January 2001 and starts making, obviously like any incoming president, high appointments into especially the Defense Department, but all other major federal bureaucracies. And the people he appointed to be his high foreign policy and military theorists and leaders, in the 1990s, these are all conservative Republicans, so Clinton didn't bring them in. He basically kept them out of government. So in the 90s, they don't have much else to do, so they get together and form a think tank that was called the Project for the New American Century. And if you ever read their founding documents, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a plan to project American dominance of the world far into the 21st century. So they have plans for what to do with Eastern Europe, what to do with Russia, what to do in relation to the Middle East and Latin America. And their major policy statement regarding Iraq and Saddam Hussein is to knock him out by one way or another. And they even take the time to write an open letter, a public letter to President Clinton in '98, arguing that Saddam Hussein should be knocked out for several different reasons, but basically that should be the driving focus of American foreign policy. So that when Clinton was in office, they gave him that argument. He rejected it. He said, no, Saddam Hussein is contained. So the clear goals, if you ever read that letter, is they say they want to protect U.S. allies in the Middle East, protect U.S. interests, which is usually economic and military, protect oil reserves, and destroy Hussein's attempt to get weapons of mass destruction, which there was no evidence for in the late 90s, and that's the evidence that Clinton went with, the lack of evidence. Clinton said he's not building those weapons, so we cannot attack him. So when Bush goes into office, he takes a lot of these guys who made that argument for attacking Iraq, puts them in control of U.S. foreign policy. And the attack will occur at some point. So going through 2001, this national coordinator, the same guy that Clinton appointed, is a holdover. He goes into the Bush White House also in the same position. He starts trying to get meetings with the high Bush leadership to warn them about Al-Qaeda. To say that Al-Qaeda should be targeted to be completely eliminated from the face of the earth. And that should be the number one goal for U.S. foreign policy. And this national coordinator, a guy named Clark, is just begging for a meeting. We have this through internal documents. When he finally got a meeting on September 4th, 2001, the CIA had already gotten massive amounts of information that an attack was, quote, imminent. somewhere in the world against U.S. interests. And that through the summer of 2001, we have reports of the head of the CIA running around the White House, quote, with his hair on fire, trying to get someone to listen. So they finally get this meeting on September 4th, a Tuesday morning. And it's called a principal meeting, which means Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the real high thinkers are involved. The national coordinator presents this argument that there is an imminent threat to U.S. national security and that Al-Qaeda is at the center of it and that Bin Laden should be eliminated. And the response from especially the Defense Department, a guy named Wolfowitz, is that there is no way that some ragtag bunch of guys running around on monkey bars basically in Afghanistan can threaten the United States. That if any kind of terrorist threat exists, it is probably built up by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So the high leadership basically rejected this argument, even though the CIA understood that some kind of attack was imminent. They had heard enough rumors and they had enough evidence. They did not know if it was going to hit in the United States or somewhere else in the world. And it seems like the CIA came to believe that the attack was going to hit in Saudi Arabia or Israel. And the evidence is accumulating throughout the summer of 2001 that something's going to happen. And eventually the feeling at the CIA was we were giving the messages to the White House, and in the end, there's not much we can do. If they refuse to listen, the attack's going to happen. And the CIA will probably be blamed for not knowing about it, which is a giant conundrum for the CIA. You know, what happens when your boss doesn't listen to advice? When something bad happens, who does the boss blame? Does the boss take the blame themselves? No, they pass it off on the lower level workers. And that's exactly what happened. So you get the September 11th attacks. First in the morning on the World Trade Center through hijacked planes. And was viewable through all of New York City. And there's a lot of documentaries and stuff you can watch on the details of this and the timeline. The towers were actually knocked down by these planes, which was surprising to many people watching because these towers were supposedly designed to withstand being struck by planes. Which leads a lot of kind of paranoid and conspiracy-minded people to think that something else also happened. But the towers fell within a matter of hours. And the American public was told that morning that 100,000 people worked in these towers, 50,000 each, and that virtually none of them got out. So Americans, through the rest of the day and for the next couple of days, literally believed that they had watched 100,000 people die on worldwide TV. Not true. It's very easily later proven that the mass majority of them got out, and that only about 3,000 or so died because they were the ones that had offices above where the planes hit, so the fires start below and there's no way out. The president goes on national TV and gives a speech and even goes before Congress within a few weeks, I think something like 2 weeks after September 11th, and announces a new foreign policy for the United States. And it is a foreign policy that is completely directed against defeating what Bush calls international terrorism. This set of ideas eventually gets brought together into what becomes known as the Bush Doctrine. And his statements are literally, the United States will not wait to be attacked again. The United States will not wait for threats to develop. The United States will go forth throughout the world and destroy threats before they can really harm the American homeland. And this opens up a whole series of debates. In the Cold War, the United States operated under a thing called Pre-Emptive Warfare, which means basically if the Soviets are lining up all their takes on the border, you have enough evidence to prove that they are getting ready to attack, therefore you're justified in hitting them first and starting the war. The Bush administration takes this a step further, going beyond preemptive war and using what they call preventive war, which basically means if there's a government that exists somewhere in the world that the U.S. leadership believes will become a threat to the United States has the responsibility and is justified in attacking that government and knocking it out. Who knows if that threat would become real in 10 or 20 years, which basically gives the United States a blank check to attack almost anyone in the world. Because who knows what the government of Israel or the government of South Africa is going to do in 30 years. If you just define them as a potential threat, they are open to attack. And once this becomes accepted in the very fearful and angry American population, literally in the days after September 11th, and I went around asking people this, what do you think the U.S. response should be against people like Bin Laden or anyone who supports him? The general American response I got from this area was, quote, bomb them into the Stone Age. So there's a lot of feelings of vengeance and hatred in the United States for the people who had caused September 11th. And the American population quickly started to accept this idea of preventive war. Especially when Bush says things like, there are certain governments that want to give Bin Laden nuclear weapons. Bin Laden gets one of those, brings it into, say, Port of Los Angeles and wipes out 16 million people. So Bush says that the U.S. is justified in attacking anyone who may give any kind of support to terrorism throughout the world. And since the Bush leadership had already been arguing that Saddam Hussein was building up weapons of mass destruction, either nuclear or biological or chemical, the argument proceeds to go from you have to knock out Bin Laden to you have to knock out any government that supports Bin Laden to Hussein has these weapons and may give them to Bin Laden at some point. So does that make sense? Question?
Yeah. So if, like on the other side, if the CIA were to know ahead of time what was happening, that's like a 7-day block. Do you think that we could have really...
The CIA had more than 7 days. They first started hearing about this in May.
Oh.
Yeah, this is weeks and weeks and weeks before. Yeah.
Like in that span, like...
The CIA was following the people who launched those attacks around in Boston, New York City, and San Diego. They followed them all over the country.
So it could have been stopped if they were notified.
Well, the CIA knew about it, and they did notify their bosses, and the bosses apparently chose to not do much about it. That's the accusation. And it's pretty well founded in the evidence and the statements that have... when this stuff happens, a lot of people in CIA quit. They say, what's the point of working here? And they quit the CIA and they go off into retirement. And they write books and they give interviews. So a lot of this stuff in the past 10 years has... A lot of documents have come out to prove these ideas. So this stuff, amongst people who pay attention to ideas like the Bush Doctrine, this stuff is not controversial. It's pretty well accepted. And this is foreign policy. This is U.S. foreign policy today. And it's tragic that the words Bush Doctrine were never mentioned in presidential debates in 2008 or 2012 or anything like that, right? This is U.S. foreign policy. But it's so generally accepted by Republicans and Democrats that it's not even something I have interest in talking about. So most Americans don't even know about this stuff. So it makes you wonder, what are you voting for? Are you voting even? I don't know. Other questions about this? No. Oops. Okay. Before going into Iraq, though, as it was very obvious a lot of the Bush leadership wanted to do, even when they went into office, when Bush went into office on January 20th, within 2 weeks, his cabinet, his high leadership, were already holding meetings on what a post-war Iraq should look like. And that invasion didn't happen for another 2 years. So it's very clear that they want to make that attempt right when they're walking into office in 2001. But they realize that they have to go after Bin Laden first, to some level, and eliminate him or destroy his capability. So within, I think it's about 3 weeks after September 11th, the United States starts bombing Afghanistan to destroy the Taliban government, the Taliban kind of political party, which is basically a religious group that controlled Afghanistan at that point. The basic U.S. demand was turn over Bin Laden or we will invade your country. And the Taliban said, have you filed any charges against Bin Laden in court for September 11th? And those charges were never filed. So The United States just said, no, we'll do that later, turn him over. So the Taliban refused to release him, arrest him or anything. So the U.S. started bombing Afghanistan, and the Taliban is, using old military technology, so they're fairly easy to bomb into near non-existence. The major problem, though, is that the United States did not send in ground forces to occupy Afghanistan and do a kind of, comb the desert kind of search for bin Laden. And Afghanistan isn't all completely desert. There's a lot of mountains, too, so it was difficult. But the United States did not want to send in the U.S. Army or the Marines right off the bat. So they hire an anti-Taliban group in Afghanistan to be basically the U.S. military boots on the ground to fight against the Taliban and try to track down bin Laden. The problem with that is that bin Laden can buy off a lot of those groups to get safe passage out into another country. So bin Laden did escape from his original places and fled eastward into the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is very mountainous, and even the Pakistani government has problems keeping control over. So it's kind of like a Wild West type of scenario. And bin Laden has a lot of religious followers in that kind of area. So the U.S. Marines didn't land in Afghanistan at all until November, and U.S. ground forces is estimated to not arrive until the following spring in enough force to really go through Afghanistan piece by piece and try to track him down. So they largely gave bin Laden basically about a 6-month window of opportunity to get out, either through American incompetence or some other kind of messed up plans. Or there's a lot of accusations that they didn't want to send in the U.S. Army into Afghanistan because they're already building up the U.S. Army to invade Iraq, and that would have messed up their timetable for invading Iraq. So questions about that at all? All right. And the U.S. Quickly transitions. Don't want to talk about the failures of not being able to find bin Laden. They try to ignore that question. And they pivot toward pointing at Saddam Hussein's Iraq for building weapons of mass destruction, and therefore to attack Iraq because they're afraid that Saddam Hussein will give weapons to people like bin Laden, which is a kind of strange statement because, remember, bin Laden hated Hussein for a long time because Hussein is a secular leader. Hussein isn't a religious leader. He doesn't want to build up any kind of theocracy. Hussein is secular, and bin Laden had offered to knock Hussein out years before, so there isn't much partnership at all between Hussein and bin Laden, and they in fact appear to hate each other very deeply. But that kind of stuff isn't really debated in the U.S. much. So the U.S. sends its Secretary of State to the UN Security Council in February of 2003 to give the best evidence that the Americans have that Hussein is building up his weapons of mass destruction. The Security Council doesn't listen to that evidence because the evidence is pretty patchy, not very overwhelming in the least. And the Security Council rejects the resolution to give the U.S. the permission to invade Iraq, and then they do it anyway in March of 2003. So the last few weeks of March, the United States invades Iraq without permission from the United Nations, which is illegal. And the U.S. conquers Iraq fairly quickly, within about 3 or 4 weeks, goes into Baghdad, knocks out Hussein's government, and then has the problem of deciding who's going to be in charge of Iraq after. Within about 2 days of Baghdad falling to American forces, the Iraqi people start pouring out into the streets, basically saying, "Thank you for getting rid of that horrible dictator. We didn't like him either. Now, please go home. We would like to run our own country." That is not the plan of the U.S. government, though. The U.S. will occupy Iraq and try to control its government for many years after. And it's not until about 2010 when the Obama administration basically admitted that the newly democratically elected government of Iraq is not going to allow the United States oil companies to dominate Iraqi oil fields or to dominate the Iraqi government. So that's stuff that's still fairly controversial even to today. And as the result of the American government not leaving Iraq quickly and withdrawing its troops, a massive insurgency breaks out, which has a lot of different sources. There's a lot of Iraqi people who just want to get rid of the U.S. military to run their own country. There's a lot of former Hussein supporters that want to take down the U.S.-backed government in order to try to bring Hussein back into power. And of course, Al-Qaeda goes into Iraq because this is a great opportunity for them to do damage to the U.S. military. And Bin Laden and many Muslims throughout the region interpret the U.S. invasion of Iraq not as getting rid of a horrible dictator, but trying to establish another foothold for U.S. power in the region to possibly dominate the whole region into the far future. So U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is questionable in 2003 and going on to the next few years. The Iraqi insurgency becomes extremely bloody and still is today. There are still bombings and assassinations going on in Iraq today. The United States started withdrawing its forces from Iraq in 2009 under Obama, because that was one of his campaign promises in 2008. His foreign policy statement in the 2008 election is basically take the American troops out of Iraq and put them back in Afghanistan to try to destroy the Taliban and destroy Al-Qaeda completely. So the withdrawal from Iraq was ongoing in 2009-2010, and the movement of those troops into Afghanistan. And in 2011, a giant amount of protest broke out throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and largely in complaint of U.S.-backed dictators, and dictators of really any kind throughout the whole region. So the United States, starting in early 2011 and ever since, has been put in a very delicate position because they have supported some of those dictators, right? Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Egypt. And now that peoples are rising up against those dictators throughout the region, the United States has decisions to make. Will it continue supporting those dictators and try to repress those populations? The U.S. has made those decisions in some countries. Or will they join with protesters and try to take down certain governments? The U.S. has made that decision, places notably like Syria. But it's largely broken down to does that dictator in that particular country take orders and do what the U.S. wants in the world? In dictatorships that follow orders from the U.S., they continue to get U.S. support. In countries that have tried to reject orders from the U.S., when uprisings hit those countries, the U.S. is usually in favor of those uprisings because they knock out what the American leaders view as enemy governments in places like Iran or Syria or Libya. So the U.S. foreign policy in relation to the so-called Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring is still up in the air about what the long-term results are going to be, but a lot of people in those regions understand what kind of decisions the U.S. is making and are not very happy about it. So questions about any of that?
Syria, for example, is I know they're asking the president to step down.
The rebels are asking the president to step down.
Will the U.S. back the rebels?
The U.S. has given kind of motivational support to the rebels, and there's rumors of U.S. sending money and weapons to the Syrian rebels. The Obama administration announced that they would send at least food aid to the rebels, what they call humanitarian aid. And there are reports of American weapons reaching the Syrian rebels. Because the Syrian government historically, for many decades now, since at least the 60s, has rejected U.S. foreign policy for the region. They have been one of the few countries that have tried to stand up to the United States.
So they're pretty much doing what they did in Libya.
Yep, and same thing with Libya. The Libyan government, up until 2011, was one of those countries that tried to stand up to U.S. power in the region. So when the U.S. saw an opportunity starting in 2011 to knock out some of those governments, they take it. So we'll see where this leads in the future. And that's largely where we are today.